Alright, welcome back folks to Did Syd Barrett, The Wall by Pink Floyd Part 2. And in this episode I want to break down the lyrics of a number of songs. I'm not going to go through the entirety of the album. That proved to be way too difficult and way too long. And I don't think other folks will have the patience for it, and it tested even my patience. And I'm kind of highly motivated to actually pay attention to these details. I understand not everybody else will be. So it ended up being an extremely dry episode. This is my fourth time putting together this episode because I just don't feel like I can get the balance correct on it. So hopefully I'll be able to do that here. I want to run through 6 songs from the Wall album. And I'm sorry if you wanted a full breakdown of lyrics, you can do so on your own. I will also run through 6 songs from the final cut. Now, I read somewhere that the final cut was kind of leftover songs after the Wall album was done. How they're left over and what the process was, I don't know. But I do know that the Wall album was released in November of '79, and the final cut is released in March of '83. It was apparently recorded the year before. So you can see how much time Pink Floyd has spent on these kinds of ideas that are loosely related. That's almost 4 years of time or longer, which is extremely long for them. If you've been paying attention to our other episodes and Peeling Syd Barrett and Did Syd series, you know that Pink Floyd kind of was in the habit of releasing about an album a year. So we have to, based on that information, think there might be a lot of detail tied up in this. This may, in many ways, kind of be an attempt to capture as much as the band could put together. And of course, this album was the great big pop hit. Dark Side of the Moon arguably has had the greater staying power, and it's easy to see why. It's a very beautiful and uplifting kind of a feel for an album. The Wall is not an uplifting feel at all, and that's part of the difficulty I've had in putting this together. It is an extremely lonely film. It is a depressing film. It is messy, I think, in many ways. And although it has an important message, and the lyrics, I think, are very strong, and the delivery of the film, I think, is quite good, the overall feel that you come away from this particular album and film is one of hopelessness, at least for me. That's what that's the feeling I have that's tied to it, which is a very, I would say, in a way, it's a fairly nihilistic view of things, which is a little bit depressing. So let's run through things, and what I would like to do then in this episode is I'm going to run through the 6 songs of the Wall, 6 songs of Final Cut, and then what I want to do is I want to break down my questions, my notes, and my takeaways. I'll attempt to interpret things, which is, of course, quite dangerous, but I want to interpret things loosely enough that perhaps we capture some of the intents of the artists, but also perhaps touch on different things that other people might also be thinking. So let's go ahead then and get started. And what I normally like to start with, of course, is comments and corrections. I don't really have a whole lot of corrections. What I would like to do is start with prize winner Pause comments on our Peeling Syd Barrett series. They made a comment about the possible artistic interpretations of Vegetable Man. So that particular episode, which is, so far it's done okay, Peeling Syd Barrett, Vegetable Man, about that particular song, and I think that was a pretty good episode that we put together for that. So they commented, basically saying, thanks for giving alternate kind of descriptions for what might have actually have been attempted by Pink Floyd, and I'll say thank you for that. I do want to give possible other interpretations because I believe that the majority of people simply have not dived into the topic. They have not paid attention to detail. They have not considered other ways of looking at Mr. Barrett and early Pink Floyd, or Pink Floyd throughout. And so there's this one kind of narrative that's driving everything, and it may be very flawed. So let's consider different possible influences and other things that are going on, and see what we come up with on our own, with an open mind. Okay, so there are two videos that I would like you to watch before we get started. The first one is kind of I believe it's by yesterday's news or letters or something like that. Anyway, it basically is about, is Pink Floyd trying to kill pop or something like that, which is a kind of an interesting take on things, and it's from the era of the 67-68 time frame when a lot of people were reacting to kind of early Pink Floyd. And within that is a number of statements specifically by Mr. Barrett. And I'll let you listen to it on your own. But one takeaway that I had from that is that they specifically mention, or Mr. Barrett does anyway, that he is not interested in partaking in the overall industry or industry control of music, and that he wants to somehow circumvent the industry's control of music, which is somewhat punk kind of a intent. And we discussed some punk influences in the first episode, and we're going to see some more here in this one as well. The second that I would like you to see is a interview by Carl Sagan about greenhouse gas emissions, and this is from like 1995 or 1985 even. And that's just kind of a side thing. The reason I'm including that is, of course, that there's a recognition of a problem that has been known for a very, very long time. And I would like to point out that this is a serious issue, and it has not been addressed. This is already past 30 years, after this kind of information has been discussed in front of our own government as an American. The rest of the world, perhaps, I don't know where they were at, but it's been a known issue. So if you're interested, you can go ahead and watch that. I'm going to make references to possible issues with that, and you may already know where I'm going if you've been paying attention to the introductory quotes that I provided at the beginning of this episode. So let's go ahead then. We'll get started on the music. I want to discuss the lyrics, and we'll run through them and see if we can find some kind of overall message, perhaps, or perhaps a few messages that are being relayed by the artists involved, what they may be trying to relay, what we can take away from what they're giving. Are there little hidden gems in here? And I think you will find that there are. And in particular, one of the reasons that this has been a difficult episode for me to put together is the earlier episode I noted the room 515. And I found something in the lyrics of a song that relays this same idea, which is, if you paid attention to our Did Syd series, Did Syd More, we broke down songs like Cirrus Minor and how there's a hidden message under the layers of the lyrics which seem to be connecting ideas. So we broke down some of the number 515. I'm going to describe that a little bit more later on in the outtakes once we're done. But for now, let's go ahead. We'll run through the songs. Let's discuss some of the meanings that are tied up in them. And then after that's done, then we'll try to wrap up ideas and see what we come up with. Without further ado then, let's go ahead, and what I would like to do is start off this episode with something kind of weird. And that is the song Run Like Hell. And I'm going to play the intro to Run Like Hell. And then I'm going to give you an intro to another song. And we've already discussed how there seems to be this kind of punk influence that's happening within this film and within this soundtrack, perhaps. And of course, there are a lot of influences previous to this with Pink Floyd. We have to remember, Pink Floyd is kind of like U2. They're a very, very historied band. They go all the way back to the 60s, and the Beatles and the beginnings of the Rolling Stones, and that entire movement, including the Who, and all we've discussed all of this in Peeling Syd Barrett. If you haven't watched that, I suggest you do. And the influences of the beat movement and some of the political, social discussions that were kind of happening within the band, and it's continuing on from frontmen like Jim Morrison into what becomes the 70s kind of punk movement, or as it's called in New York a little bit later on, the New Wave, because punk had become kind of a distasteful name for the movement. Too many people. At any rate, I'm going to play the intro to Run Like Hell, and then I'm going to hit you with another song. And I want you to kind of notice this. Maybe you're already aware of this. I don't know. I heard this song on the way home, and I thought, that's interesting. That's very similar to Run Like Hell. So here you go. Okay, so hopefully you enjoyed that. Kind of funny, isn't it? A lot of people don't really think of Blondie as being kind of a punk group, but they were a new wave. They played New York. They were part of that movement. They were playing in the same areas and the same clubs as bands like the Ramones, very punk band. And of course, New York and London were kind of the punk scene for a very long time. So, well, I don't know that much about London. I assume London when I talk about English and British punk bands, but perhaps not, perhaps that was somewhere else. So Blondie, very similar intro, don't you think, to Run Like Hell? At any rate, let's run through the lyrics then to that song, Run Like Hell. If you would pull them up on your phone, we can kind of discuss them. Now, if you remember in the film, this is the part where these jackboot thugs are kind of running around, and it's reminiscent, of course, of the Kristallnacht and the various Nazi kind of statements within the film, which makes sense. The great fear of Orwell that's tied to not just the Nazis but also the communists, and the English reaction to that, the threat of those two groups, of course, is quite significant. And they run around beating up kids, and particularly here we see them doing a number of things. We already discussed the dogs and the civil rights movement, and police releasing dogs on people, particularly black Americans. But in this also is an interracial couple, and they get beaten, and it's really kind of miserable. But I guess it relays the message well enough. So let's look at the lyrics. There's a bunch of runs, and then a statement that you better make up your face in a disguise and button down your lips and roller blind eyes. Now, what a roller blind eye is, I don't know. And you should have an empty smile and a hungry heart, and feel the bile that's rising from your guilty pasts. And your nerves are in tatters, and the conch shell shatters. Hammers batter down your door, you better run. Okay, so what all is being stated there? There's a lot of information there. First off, I'll just point out it is very simple word combinations. There are a few interesting ideas like roller blind eyes, button down lips. A button down lip doesn't seem too inventive, but it is a little bit, I suppose. But roller blind eyes seems to be a bit of a Barrettism, potentially. It has alliteration in it. But the content of the words themselves is very heavy, and I would say that in many ways the simplicity and harshness of the delivery makes me think of Mr. Waters. This is something that he is quite good at. And I will also point out something else, that if you were going to make a punk-like album, it actually favors Mr. Roger Waters' writing style, in my opinion, more than Mr. Barrett. Mr. Barrett is kind of a feelings-related writer. He's very poetic. He's very gilded. The way he gilds his language is significant and easily detected. It would not do well in a punk kind of band or punk setting. But Mr. Waters would seem to possess that in some ways. So this first kind of portion of the song is quite accusatory. In other words, people are just kind of going along with this, and or a very specific person. It's accusatory that a person has an empty smile and a hungry heart, and they're guilty. They have a guilty past, but their nerves are in tatters. Of course, all of these things are what happens when a person is complicit and cooperative in a negative environment. And of course, we all participate in whatever society we're in. If that society becomes negative over time, we each carry some guilt in that happening, and perhaps that's what's being relayed here. So let's continue on with the song. Depressing idea, but of course there were many, many good Germans, and I've known quite a few Germans, and I have to say that for whatever reason I find them to be quite interesting and nice people as a general rule. So you have to ask yourself, how can something so miserable as the history of the Nazis happen in a country that's full of people that are generally pretty good? Well, there's your answer right there. People just kind of, the average person tends to kind of go along with things, apparently. So perhaps that's what they're calling out. I don't know. But let's move on with the analysis. You better run all day and night and keep your dirty feelings inside. And if you take your girlfriend out tonight, you better park your car out of sight. Because if they catch you trying to pick her locks. Now, pick her locks is an interesting combination of words. It reminds me of bike, in that Mr. Barrett mentioned having a room full of clocks. And here is pick her locks, which is obviously a sexual metaphor. And then they'll send you home to mother in a cardboard box. So all very simple, very blunt, very harsh, very punk feel to this. I don't have a whole lot of Syd Barrett kind of influences that I can point to in this. I'll give each one of these songs a Syd Barrett score, and for Button Down Lips and Roller Blind Eyes, I suppose I'll give a point. That's kind of an interesting combination, but also there seems to be kind of an air of perhaps sexual promiscuity or incorrectness, and that topic is something that Mr. Barrett did touch on quite a bit, especially in a song like Arnold Lane. So I'm going to give this song 2 points on a Syd Barrett score, and that's very, very minimal. If you've been following along, you know that that's not much of an influence, but it's there. Okay, so the next song that I would like to cover or discuss is the song Mother. Now, this song, obviously, just from the title already, I can give it 1 point because Mr. Barrett did a song called Matilda Mother. So there's 1 point already. It starts off with Mother, do you think they'll drop the bomb? Well, that, of course, is tied to our previous episode, to Mr. Warhol's paintings. We discussed that. And, of course, to Mr. Barrett's own drawings. So that's another point right there. So 2 points. Do you think they'll like the song or break his balls? Should he just build a wall? Or run for president or trust the government? Or will they put him in the firing line? Now that's an interesting, I'm going to put a point for that one. And the reason is because we mentioned Mr. Goya and the Spanish paintings, and we called out a specific firing line painting, which is very famous by Mr. Goya, which has the church in the background. And of course, there's a church in the background of Arnold Lane. And it seems to be a possible correlation that perhaps Mr. Barrett was making there. I don't know, but here's a mention of a firing line. Or are things just a waste of time? Now his mother answers back. She says, don't cry. She's going to make nightmares come true and put fears into you and keep you under her wing and not let you fly, but might let you sing. So Mr. Barrett often mentions flying in his music, in his lyrics, so I'll give a point there. This idea of an overprotective mother, I don't know. Obviously, Mr. Barrett had a very strong connection with his mother, but I can't say necessarily that that's a Waters or a Barrett thing. I've read some people say that he did have an overprotective mother. I don't know, but I guess you'll just have to decide. I don't feel strong enough about it to give a point. So let's continue on. Mama's going to help build a wall. And then the singer, the Pink character, asks, Mother, do you think she's good enough? Or do you think she's dangerous? Or will she tear your little boy apart? Will she break his heart? This sounds very, very Barrett-esque. His solo music was extremely caught up in the idea of romantic love. And Mr. Waters, of course, obviously had been, I believe at this point in time, he had been married. He was on his second marriage. But perhaps, Mr. Waters is quite deep, and he just has a way to hide these things so that people don't recognize that they're going on. But certainly Mr. Barrett sung about this very topic. I'll give another point. I'm at 5. And so then the mother answers. She says she's going to check out his girlfriends, and she won't let dirty people get through. And she'll wait up till you get back and find out where you've been, make sure you're healthy and clean, etc. And then there's the last thing of Mother didn't need to be so high, or Mother did it need to be so high. I'm not sure which is the lyric there. But this idea of going up high in the sky or climbing a hill is something that Mr. Barrett discusses. So I end up with 6 points, because that being up on a hill kind of idea is something that runs through a lot of his music. So 6 points for Mother. Let's move on to the next song, Goodbye Blue Sky. So if you would call that one up on your phone. Now this is the kind of cartoon portion with the plane of death. And I just want to point out really quickly that the plane looks kind of like a raven, which is important to the English because it's an important bird to the English. I suppose a lot like why the eagle is important to the United States itself. Of course, ravens also were very important birds to the tribes, the native tribes of North America. And I don't know if that's true for all, but certainly for a number of them, ravens obviously are very special birds. And the correlation that's being made in this cartoon is a very destructive one, but I think that's unfortunate, because a raven, in my mind, is not just a destructive bird. But at any rate, it is colored black, which is considered by many people to be destructive. So let's look at the lyrics. It starts out with a child saying there's an airplane in the sky. And then, did you see the frightened ones? This song kind of reminds me of The Who, and their song about the pinball machine player. I can't remember where he's constantly stuttering. Oh no, Talking About My Generation. That's the song. Sorry. It's, of course, it's not actually stuttering. I'm not sure why they're doing the did you part, but it reminds me of Talking About My Generation. So, and the falling bombs, and ever wonder why we had to run for shelter when the promise of a brave new world unfurled beneath the clear blue sky. So that is a very interesting combination of words. I'm going to give a point for that. I'm going to give 2 points for that. So Goodbye Blue Sky, I have 2 points. And I'll explain why. The first is because we have a new world unfurled beneath a clear blue sky. So there's obvious alliteration with the L world, the L happening there, and the world unfurled and clear blue sky. Very similar sounds. Now, the other reason is, of course, because there's a mention of Brave New World, and we've discussed that in our Peeling Syd Barrett series. That very, very specific book, and also the Shakespearean reference within it. And we've noted the very, very many Shakespearean references that Mr. Barrett likes to make within his music. So I'll give another point for that. Now, it continues on with seeing the frightened ones, or falling. Did you see the falling bombs? Flames are gone, but the pain is lingering on. So this is a little bit odd to me now, and I'll just kind of explain why. Neither Mr. Barrett nor Mr. Waters would have direct knowledge of the war. So that single statement there, the flames are gone, but the pain lingers on, who would that be more true for? Mr. Barrett didn't have any losses tied directly to the war, but Mr. Waters did. So that statement points to Mr. Waters quite specifically as an author of this. It ties in with his own personal history. The flames of the war are gone, but he's still in pain, and the reason for that is, of course, that the war took his father. So goodbye, blue sky, etc. And I end up with a score of 2 points, I believe, for that song as a Syd Barrett influenced song, which again is not a whole lot. Now, the next song I would like to look at is Nobody Home. This is a song that a lot of people very much like, including myself. So let's look through it and see if we can tie any Syd Barrett influences in this song. The very first line, I've got a little black book to keep my poems in. Now we know Mr. Barrett kept diaries. We know he kept books. It's referenced in numerous sources. But of course, someone else who did that was Jim Morrison. And people that write extensively often have books constantly around that they're writing in. So particularly poets and writers, you never know when something's going to come to your mind or you find an interesting combination of words. So they constantly keep books and poems with them. So I'm going to give a point for that. And of course, that's something Mr. Waters could have also been doing. I don't know, but I do know that Mr. Barrett kept books. Whether or not they're little black books, I don't know. But that's certainly 1 point. So I'll give 1 point for that. He has a bag, a toothbrush, and a comb. And if he's a good dog, they sometimes throw him a bone. Now that doesn't make sense for Mr. Barrett. This is another example of something that would very likely be a Waters reference. And the reason I say this is because there are numerous references to cats by Mr. Barrett, not dogs. In fact, he very, very rarely in his own music I'm trying to think of examples. He discusses a wolf pack, but of course a wolf is not a dog. Within the analysis that we did on Dark Side of Oz, we mentioned that Toto could possibly be a representation of Mr. Barrett, but his music specifically doesn't really seem to mention dogs. He seems to be more of a cat person. So I will say that that's more than likely not a Waters influence. Now, in our past episode, we have the next line. I have elastic bands keeping my shoes on. And if you remember, we saw the elastic bands on the boots. And of course, the elastic bands could be a reference to the abuse of opiates. And the next line confirms that. They got the swollen hand blues. So the swelling of the hands, the numbness of the hands, all could be indicative of opiate abuse. So because Mr. Barrett makes numerous references to opiate abuse in his songs, or at least Poppy's, I'm going to give another point, so I'm at 2. The next line is having 13 channels of crap on the TV to choose from. Kind of a funny statement, very punk. Mr. Barrett already was mocking television. He did so in Scream Thy Last Scream, Scrubbling Bubbles, and Watching Telly for All Hours, I believe, was his kind of a joke about, which was obviously condescending. I'll give another point. He says he has electric light and second sight and powers of observation. I have amazing powers of observation. That's how I knew. Now, in our breakdown of peeling Syd Barrett apples and oranges, we specifically mentioned that CU lime is kind of a power of observation line. So I'm going to give another point for that. So I'm at 4 points. That's this idea of having second sight or seeing things. It's also in a song like Terrapin, where Mr. Barrett sings about being able to see someone at night or go flying at night and see them. And that's how I knew. I tried to get through a telephone to you. There'll be nobody home. Now, in episode 1, we discussed how this, of course, may be related to the trip that the entire band took in '67 through the United States that went poorly. The reference to the telephone could be a very specific incident that has not been made clear. But we do discuss that somewhat in Apples and Oranges, peeling Syd Barrett apples and oranges. The next line, I've got the obligatory Hendrix perm. Ah, interesting, isn't that? Of course, Mr. Barrett did have a Hendrix perm. Mr. Waters never did. So why would Mr. Waters write a song saying that he's got the obligatory Hendrix perm? I have no idea. Of course, he could be writing it from the point of view of the character that he's invented, which would be a very simple explanation. But of course, that is something that ties in quite specifically with Mr. Barrett, even if it's only an indirect influence, it's here. The inevitable pinhole burns, of course, that could be another, I'll say another drug reference, so I'm at 6. All down the front of his favorite satin shirt. This kind of discussion about having a satin shirt reminds me of Vegetable Man and Mr. Barrett singing about having a paisley shirt. So again, a kind of a condescending nature statement about their own clothes. So I'll give another point for that. So I'm at 7. Nicotine stains on the fingers and a silver spoon on a chain. Of course, a silver spoon is someone who's born into some form of wealth, and the chain could have something to do with that. But I'll just point out 2 things. Of course, the silver spoon could be another opiate reference, so I'll give a point. But also the chain idea of being chained to something has been used by Mr. Barrett in his song Dark Globe when he mentions being tied to a specific type of chain. And I won't go into that too much, but it's in the lyrics for Dark Globe, so I'm at 9 points. They have a grand piano to prop up their mortal remains. They have wild staring eyes. Well, who has wild staring eyes? Obviously, Mr. Barrett. That was something he was specifically noted for and was called out by Jack Kerouac in the Subterraneans, as we discussed in Peeling Syd Barrett. They have a strong urge to fly, but nowhere to go to. Well, again, flying. I'm at 11 points now for this song. Quite a few correlations within this song, Nobody Home, that seems to be quite influenced by Mr. Barrett. But when he picks up the phone, there's nobody home. So that's pretty much it for Nobody Home. Quite a few correlations. I think any objective person would agree. The next song I would like to discuss is Comfortably Numb. Now, there are only so many types of drugs that can be abused that will make someone feel incredibly numb. And of course, one of them is opiates. Just want to point that out. So let's go ahead then and take a listen or check out the lyrics. If you want to call them up on your phone, please feel free to do so. It starts out with a bunch of hellos that are kind of receding. And then, is there anybody there? Not if you can hear me. Anybody home? I hear you're feeling down. Is there anything we can use to ease your pain? Well, painkillers, something that has pain or is utilized to control or manage pain is, of course, opiates. So right there is another potential opiate reference. I won't give a point for that, but I just want to note it. Okay, so get you on your feet again, relax, need some information, basic facts. Where does it hurt? Again, more mention of pain, you're just receding. There's a distant ship, smoke on the horizon, only coming through in waves. Okay, so this wave idea, this wave information, it's kind of caught within a song like Echoes from Metal. And of course, that's attributed to Pink Floyd, and that's without Syd Barrett. But it's also kind of tied up in the idea of the Song of Terrapin and being in the water and being fishes that are kind of bumping noses. And Mr. Barrett makes quite a few references, including in the song Opal, to the ocean and this kind of feeling that's tied to the ocean. At any rate, let's continue on. Says that the lips are moving but can't hear what they're saying, and then when he was a child he had a fever and their hands felt like balloons. Why they would feel that, I don't know. I do want to point out that Mr. Barrett, I believe, was quite sick with mono when he was young, but I don't know, pretty much every child gets sick with a fever, so I'm not going to give any points for that. I can't explain, you wouldn't understand, this isn't how I am. I've become comfortably numb. Okay, there's a pinprick. You may feel a little sick. Stand up. I believe it's working. That'll keep you going through the show. It's time to go. And then it repeats until you get to the portion where they say, "When I was a child, I caught a fleeting glimpse. Turned to look, but it was gone. The child is grown. The dream is gone." Well, that right there, of course, makes me think of Mr. Barrett because he gave up on the dream. Mr. Waters did not. He was living the dream, basically. So who would be writing about having a dream that was gone? I don't know. Perhaps there's some other dream that Mr. Waters had that was gone. But most definitely the idea of becoming some form of a rock star or something to that effect was totally gone for Mr. Barrett. So that would seem to be something for Mr. Barrett. So I'm just going to give 1 point for this song, Comfortably Numb. Let's go ahead and move on then to the next song. And the next song really is a combination of all of the Another Brick in the Wall songs. Now, these are very simple. I just have a few points I want to make about them. And I just want to include something as background. Now, one of the things that I want to point out, of course, as we discussed in the first episode, is that Eric Fletcher Waters, who was Mr. Waters' father, was born in 1914 and he died in 1944. Now, he was a teacher, so consider that. Roger Waters' own father was a teacher. And if you've been paying attention, you'll notice that this film and the songs are very, very kind of condescending to teaching and to education. How can we reconcile that? It doesn't really seem to make sense. How can someone whose own father, who was a teacher, be so, I guess you could say, disgusted with the way that things are presented? I suppose it could make sense, of course, if you think that your father was a very good man and that the rest of these teachers are not measuring up to who your father might have been. Or perhaps you've idealized what teaching a profession should be like because you've idealized your own father. I don't know. That's a lot of assumptions to make, but I'll just point out that there seems to be a disconnect there between the idea that this person, Roger Waters, loves and misses his father, wishes obviously that he had been able to spend time with him or connect with him on some level, but knowing that his father was a teacher and, by the way, was also a devout Christian and a Communist Party member. So yeah, go figure that one. At any rate, let's look at the lyrics and let's try and figure out kind of what takeaways we can make from this. So the first version of it is part 1. It starts off with Daddy flying across the ocean, and there's just a memory that's a snapshot in the family album. What's left for me? Nothing, just a brick in the wall. Okay, that very, very clearly sounds like something that relates to Mr. Waters. I see no interesting combination of words there. It's very free form. There's no alliteration. There's no rhyming other than repetition. Me, wall, wall. Let's look at part 2, Another Brick in the Wall. This is where we get the "we don't need no education." Now, that's very catchy, by the way. I just want to point that out. And the reason it's catchy is because it's extremely alliterative. Don't need no education. So look at all the D, T's, and of course D and T is related in the mouth. It's a very similar sound, so phonetically very related. So D and T, but also the N's, need no education. So it's very, very, it's very ironic that this saying, "we don't need no education," is extremely catchy. And the next line is, of course, "we don't need no thought control." But of course, the catchiness of the first line is a form of thought control. It's extremely ironic. Kind of funny to me in a way, kind of a joke, perhaps, something that would have been funny to some folks. They don't need dark sarcasm in the classroom. I don't know exactly what else that means. Leave the kids alone, leave the kids alone. You're just a brick in the wall. And it continues on. And let's go ahead and then look at the third portion. Of course, the teacher's saying all these ridiculous things about putting in meat. I'm not going to get into all that. And here's where the character Pink kind of flips out and he says, I don't need arms around me or drugs to calm me. Who needed drugs to be calm? Does that make sense from Roger Waters' point of view? I don't know. I'm going to give a point for that. So I'm at 2 points. One is for the catchiness of and the irony of the we don't need education. But also for this, the idea of drugs being used to calm someone, which I'm not aware of Mr. Waters having any of that. So I'm going to give a point for influence of Mr. Barrett. So I'm at 2. Seeing the writing on the wall. Now that's Mene Tekel Paris. We've discussed that as a religious reference. It is in the Bible, Daniel. So that's 3 points. I don't need anything at all. It's all just bricks in the wall. So I have 3 points for that another brick in the wall. Now I want to ask a deeper question, and you just think about this on your own. And I think that's pretty much it for the breakdown of songs in the wall. So I just want to do kind of a discussion really quick about the wall before we move on. The first is the seemingly negative interpretation of schooling. Now we mentioned that in our first episode there seems to be this kind of rebellion that's tied into the punk movement that had been popular in the late 70s and early 80s. Perhaps a reaction to too much control, I don't know. But I want to point out that, who does this kind of fit as an artist? Who does this kind of fit, and what is the message that's trying to be relayed here? Of course, there are a lot of philosophical ideas that are tied into, like Karl Marx, who kind of brings up this idea of workers getting upset and then just kind of destroying things. It's in his writing. So, is that what's being referenced? Is this kind of a socialist kind of a philosophy tied in with a film, tied in with this music that's discussing all the pressures of life and the pressure to conform, and then it just kind of upwelling in this popular kind of rebellious movement that's in punk music? I don't know. I mean, it's there. What is the intent of it? I just want to point out something really quickly. One of the reasons why this movie, and as I mentioned, I went back and watched it. It's not an easy watch for me anymore, and the reason is because I feel a dearth of hope. I've been thinking about this for a while now, and the reason I feel a dearth of hope appears to be because I don't see any positives. I don't see any options in this film and in these stories. So, for example, let's go back to Dark Side of the Moon. There were negative aspects tied within Dark Side of the Moon, but you come away from that album feeling quite uplifted. This particular film and album feels like it's stepping on you with a jackboot. You can feel it. And it's extremely distressing and depressing, but it doesn't offer alternatives for how to change that dynamic. As we mentioned in Peeling Syd Barrett series, the possibilities of the counter culture and the beats, and how perhaps there were these people that had these big ideas, but it all just kind of falls apart. And here again, perhaps this is relaying the same thing happening. You have this kind of punk movement in the mid to late 70s, and it's being bought out by corporate ideals. And although it probably started with some kind of an idea, in the same way that revolutionary Spain started out with some kind of an idea, all discussed by Mr. Orwell. We discussed all these topics in Peeling Syd Barrett. Eventually, the people involved seem to lose focus on what it is that they really want, how to fix problems, and then and then you have a new form of power structure that kind of just sweeps in and takes over whatever the movement is and uses it to its own ends. It's very depressing to think about. Perhaps that's what's being relayed. I don't know. Now, who would relay something like that? I don't know. But I just want to point out that people that do complain about Mr. Waters being kind of negative and whinging and whatever, whinging was the word used by someone that was interviewed. I can't remember who. I'll try to include that interview in the description. There were a series of interviews about Syd Barrett, but I just want to point out that you can see that there are a lot of influences of Mr. Barrett. And Mr. Barrett's own solo work, I guess you could call whinging if you really wanted to. It's quite sad and heartbroken. So I don't like the idea of trying to tie things that are, I guess you could say, kind of sad or depressing just to Mr. Waters. It seems to run through a lot of the music philosophically. So I guess that's pretty much it. Let's go ahead then and move on to the Final Cut album. I'm going to do 6 songs and in the Final Cut, and we'll try and trace Syd Barrett influences in those songs as well. The first one is Your Possible Pasts. So if you would, call up the lyrics to Your Possible Pasts. It starts out with, they flutter behind you, your possible pasts. Some are bright-eyed and crazy, and some are frightened and lost. So I'm going to go ahead and give flutter behind you, possible pasts. A little bit of alliteration, not too much. Bright-eyed and crazy. Some are frightened and lost. So this idea of being bright-eyed and crazy or frightened and lost seems to be a Barrett reference, so I'm going to give a point there. And then there's a warning to anyone in command of their possible future to take care. I'm going to give another point, and I want to point out something to you here. There's a mention right there, possible past and possible future. Quite interesting. Now, I'll take you back to the room number, 515. The number 515. So possible pasts, and for many people, the number 5 represents this kind of released energy. It's not collected. So possible past and possible future. And if you're in command of things right now, the present would be a 1. So 515. So I don't know. You decide. I just noticed that now. But the story that I wanted to tell you about is this idea of possible past and possible futures being difficult is, of course, dealt with by Miss Sylvia Plath, and it's in The Bell Jar when she is discussing the fig tree, and she discusses a fig tree on a couple of occasions, but on one in particular, and I'll try to put it up here for you, she's discussing the very difficult time that she has in making decisions because of all the possible futures that are tied in with this symbolic representation of figs that are ripening in her life, but she can't have all of them, so she has to choose. And of course, that's something that we all face on some level. We have to choose what are the most important things to us, and though we can do certain things, we cannot do all things. So that's a little bit frustrating for some people to deal with. Let's go ahead then and continue on. And we've discussed thoroughly Sylvia Plath. We discussed her in the previous episode and also in Peeling Syd Barrett. And I will say I think she was a genius. And if you have not read The Colossus and her poetry, you really need to read it. I'm not a fan of The Bell Jar, but I will say that the Colossus collection of poetry is amazing. It may be the best collection of poetry I've ever read. Just going to throw that out there. Okay, so let's continue on. The song continues in derelict sightings of poppies entwined. So there's a reference of poppies. I'll give another point for that. So I'm at 3 points now. And cattle trucks lying in wait for the next time. I'll give another point. And we've discussed Modernity and the Holocaust, that book, and this idea of the next Holocaust being right around the corner. It's a very disturbing one, but if you read Modernity and the Holocaust, I think you'll understand the twist in logic that allows for amorality. And of course, I believe the Romans had a saying, something along the lines of, for an empire, nothing is wrong that is expedient, or something like that. So when power is involved, whatever is expedient is acceptable. I'll try and look up that quote, and if I can't find it and you know what it is, then try and throw it in the comments. So let's continue on. Do you remember me? It used to be, do you think we should be closer? Well, all right. That seems to be indicating a lost relationship, and of course, Mr. Waters had a relationship that was ended in his first marriage, so perhaps it's something that makes sense for both men. The song continues that she's in the doorway with a ghost of a smile, and she's haunting her face. Cold eyes are imploring the men in their max. Cold eyes. That reminds me of a Barrett song where he mentions that she gazed all over his arms and she's being kind of cold. So I'll give a point for that, and I'll put the song up here. It's not exactly the same, but it has the same feel to it. For their gold and the knives in their backs, and one of the men stands up and puts out his hand and says he was just a child then, but now he's only a man. The chorus then goes again about remember me, how we used to be. By the cold and religious, taken in hand, shown how to feel good and told to feel bad. Strung up behind them the banners and flags, possible past lie, tatters and rags. I end up with 5 points there. There's some very interesting connections, but only 5 points. So let's move on to the next score. Now, the next song, sorry. These songs are, of course, from the Final Cut album, and this album was released in March of 83. It was made the year before. I believe from July through December it was recorded. So I'm not exactly sure when the movie was released, but I believe it was released in 82. I did previously believe that these were songs that were left over. Perhaps they were left over, written down somewhere, but not recorded. But apparently these were all recorded during or after the film was released, long after the first, the Wall album had been recorded. So let's look at kind of an important song, which is, let me see, The Gunner's Dream. So it starts off with floating down through the clouds. Now, we've seen this before in Mr. Barrett's songs. I believe Flaming starts off with the idea of being in the clouds, so I'll give a point there. Memories are coming to rush up to meet him now. This idea of having memories or dreams and flying is consistent with Mr. Barrett. So I'll give another point. That's 2 points. And the space, the heavens, the corner of a foreign field, I had a dream. So right there's a dream reference, just as we expected. It ties in with memories and dreams. The next portion states goodbye Max and goodbye Ma. And that's quite interesting, of course, because Mr. Barrett's father was named Max. So why would a song written by Mr. Waters be saying goodbye Max and Ma? Of course, Max then would be inferred or assumed to be the father, and the father of Mr. Barrett was Max. So I'm at 3 points, and that's quite a strange combination. I think you would agree. And goodbye Ma, and then after the service, you're walking to the car, and silver in her hair is shining in the cold November air, and you hear a tolling bell. Now that idea of a tolling bell, of course, is discussed in Dark Side of the Moon. We discussed that in Did Syd Dark Side of the Moon, and the references that tie in with this idea of a tolling bell. Now, and there's a soak in a lapel, and the teardrops rise to beat the band, and take her frail hand and hold on to the dream. So here's something to consider about that. We have I guess you could say, loosely organized subjects. So right here is a statement of goodbye Max and goodbye Ma. And then you're walking to the car, and there is silver in her hair. Whose hair? I don't know. He just said goodbye to Max and goodbye to Ma. So whose hair is shining silver in the November air? I don't know. But that ambiguity is consistent with a number of Mr. Barrett's songs, and he seems to enjoy that ambiguity. Anyway, take her frail hand and hold on to the dream. So the point being possibly that he's discussing his own mother here. Of course, the question is begged then, why are they at a service? What kind of a service, and why in November? Now, I don't believe that Mr. Barrett's father passed away in November. I'll put the passed away date here. I believe it was, I think it was later than that. But why there would be a service and everything, I don't know. But you'll have to decide on your own. Okay, let's continue on. The song that mentions having a place to stay and enough to eat, and there's old heroes down the street. You can speak out loud about fears, and no one disappears, and you never hear the standard issue kicking in your door. Another Nazi reference, obviously. You can relax on both sides of the tracks and maniacs. So there's a relax both sides of the tracks and maniacs. That's inline rhyme that's consistent with something Mr. Barrett likes to do. I'll give a point. Don't blow holes in, and no one kills children anymore. No one kills the children anymore. And then night after night, the dream is driving the writer of this song insane. And the gunner is sleeping. The gunner is sleeping tonight in the corner of some foreign field. What's done is done. Very strange song. So, who exactly is this gunner? At any rate, I end up with 5 points. But I have a lot of questions, of course. Who is this gunner? If this relates to the wall, there's no gunner. You know, who's this gunner that's being discussed in this song? It doesn't appear to have anything to do with the Wall album itself. It seems like an entirely different character. So take from that what you will, but I can't correlate it to anything in the movie. Now, the next song I would take a look at is called Paranoid Eyes. Again, here's the statement of button your lip and don't let the shield slip. Okay, so this idea of having a mask and covering what you feel and think. We've discussed that Mr. Barrett may have been doing that. That may be the reason for the Madhouse Eyes, as called by Mr. Jack Kerouac. So I'll give 1 point for that. You put on a brave face and slip the road, and you fix your grin as you casually lean on the bar. Just looking for alliteration and rhyme here. I don't see too much. Laughing loud at the rest of the world with the boys in the crowd, and you hide behind petrified eyes. Well, I don't know how someone would be laughing too loud at the rest of the world with the boys in the crowd. That would seem to require that you are able to fit in with the rest of the people in the crowd, which is not something Mr. Waters could have done. He would have been quite famous, I would think. So I'm going to give another point for Mr. Barrett, because by this time the world had already largely forgotten Mr. Barrett. You believed in their stories of fame and fortune and glory, and now you're lost in a haze of alcohol, soft middle age. I don't know if Mr. Waters is a drinker. I do suspect that Mr. Barrett was, based on a number of references, but I'm not going to mess around with that one too much. And here again is that idea, the pie is miles too high, so trying to reach for something up high in the sky again. And then you hide behind brown and mild eyes. Now, that would indicate to me not a Mr. Barrett reference, because Mr. Barrett had green eyes, not brown eyes. So at any rate, I end up with a score of 3. Let's move on to the next song. The next song is called The Final Cut. I'm gonna finish with that song. I'm not gonna do that one. Let's do The Hero's Return. So the hero's return, if you would pull that up on your phone. It starts out with Jesus, Jesus. We've mentioned the many Christian references within Mr. Barrett's music. I guess I'll give a point for that. Of course, we also mentioned that Mr. Waters' father was quite Christian, so perhaps that's not fair, Perhaps they both were quite Christian. But I know that Mr. Barrett was quite influenced by it. He discusses a number of Christ references within his music. I'll give 1 point. Trying to clout ingrates into shape. The lights should have been out. Didn't have time to whine and mope about. And part of him flies over Dresden at Angels 1:5. Never fathom behind sarcasm, desperate memories lie. So quite interesting combinations of words there. So flies over Dresden at Angels 1:5. I'm kind of stretching there for alliteration, but it's there. The idea of flying, of course, is consistent with Mr. Barrett. I'll give a point for that. But also, it ties in with the gunner's dream. This idea that's presented in the gunner, which is not in the film The Wall. So there seems to be a new character that's a gunner and is flying, quite possibly in a bomber, I would assume. Okay, the next verse is quite touching. The singer mentions, "Sweetheart, are you asleep?" Because that's good, because that's the only time I can really speak to you. They've locked something away. It's too painful to see the light of day. So whoever this person is hiding something so deeply that they can't even share it with their significant other, which is extremely depressing. And again, I'll just point out, it ties in with a stereotype of men that's extremely damaging, in my opinion. It's toxic to everyone. It's toxic to the people that are with them, and it's damaging to the men themselves, because they are not able to live a fully fulfilled life by hiding aspects of themselves from the people that are close to them. So, and there are various reasons why men choose to do so. Obviously, every person is different, and every man is different. But some men do that because they think they're supposed to be strong and lead by example. Some men do it because they have a weakness and they're afraid of their weakness. So they're afraid that they're not in control of it. So if they speak to it, then they might be empowering it. At any rate, I just want to point out the utter loneliness of that verse. It's extremely depressing to me, in my opinion, that someone would feel that way. Whether or not they really did and it's just a song, I don't know. But that's a painful thing to hear someone say, that they're unable to share aspects of themselves, even with people that they deeply love. That's not how the world should be. Okay, so when the next verse is discussing coming back from the war, and there's banners and flags, and people danced and sang, and the church bells rang, but burning in this person's heart was a memory of the gunner's dying words on the intercom. So now we know that the gunner actually died. Okay, perhaps this was going to be a whole nother movie, like a follow-up to The Wall. I don't know. It's an interesting kind of a story. I don't know what's behind it. It seems fabricated to a large degree, but let's see. Hero's Return. I'm going to say I end up with 2 points for the Hero's Return. Let's move on to the next song, which is titled Two Suns in the Sunset. I like this song quite a bit. It feels positive, but it also has these kind of negative aspects in it. So, Two Suns in the Sunset, let's run through it really quickly. Pull it up on your phone if you would. It starts off with a discussion about looking in the rearview mirror, and the sun is going down. So, of course, the sun going down is the end of some life or light. It's a negative symbol. It's sinking behind bridges in the road, and there are good things that are left undone. And this person is having premonitions that they're suffering from. and those premonitions are confirming their suspicions of a Holocaust to come. Now, for many people, this is kind of a touchy one, for me anyway, because this idea of a Holocaust or an apocalypse, I guess you could call it, is something that is obviously within a lot of religious teaching, and particularly within Christian literature. There's an entire tradition of apocalyptic literature, and there's a very fine line between studying those things and becoming kind of morbidly fascinated with it actually coming true, and kind of hoping that it will. And there's a lot of historically speaking anyway, there's a lot of cultish activity, I guess you could say, about this idea of a Holocaust in the future, an apocalypse, and people get really wound up in this stuff. But it's a very disturbing thought to me that people actually would be spending their time kind of hoping for this to happen in a way. I hope that's not what's being relayed here in the song. I don't think that that's what's happening here. That's just kind of an aside thought that's running through my mind as I'm reading through this. Okay, the next verse mentions a rusty wire holding a cork. It keeps the anger in, it gives away, and then it's day again. And the sun is in the east, but even though the day is done, and there's two suns in the sunset, could be the human race's run. So what could be causing this sun in the east? Why would there be two suns in a sunset? Well, quite possibly this is, of course, a reference to a nuclear explosion. So I'll give another point for that, as we've already mentioned in our previous discussion about that topic. And then the next verse mentions there's this screaming kind of singing. Actually, Mr. Waters is quite good at this. Like the moment when the brakes lock and you slide toward a big truck, and then you're stretching moments and you don't hear voices or faces, and there's no recourse. And then the windshield melts and tears evaporate, and there's just charcoal. And ashes and diamonds, phone friend, everyone's equal in the end. So everything is kind of turned to ash. So this obviously is relaying this great fear of an apocalypse or Holocaust, a nuclear Holocaust, a nuclear war possibility that is consuming the writer of the song. Appears to be anyway. That's one possible reading of it. Okay, now as I mentioned, the last song that I want to run through is the final cut. So if you would look at the final cut, pull that up on your phone. It's quite a revelatory song, in my opinion. This will be the last one that we'll run through, and then I'll do some final thoughts. All right? So this song starts off with through fish-eyed lens of tear-stained eyes. Okay, so seeing things through a fish-eyed lens. Well, again, here's another fish comparison, and that's in Terrapin. In the song Terrapin by Mr. Barrett, the same idea, so we'll give a point for that. You can't define the shape of the moment in time, and this person isn't flying high in clear blue skies, so there's another flying reference. I'll give another point. They're spiraling down to the hole in the ground, and that's where they're going to hide. So who's hiding in holes? Not Mr. Waters, but very much that's something that sounds like something Mr. Barrett would do and say. So if you can negotiate, and there's a minefield in the drive, and beat the dogs in the cold electronic eyes. There's a book that kind of reminds me of this cold electronic eye idea. I believe it's Fahrenheit. I can't remember the name of the. I'll put it here though. This idea of this cold electronic eye that's registering people as they kind of come into work and go, and it's kind of denoting who's good and who's not, or who's acceptable. This kind of cold technology world idea. It's in that Fahrenheit 451 or something like that. Anyway, let's continue on. If you can make it past the shotgun in the hall, and there's a combination in a priest hole, and if they're in, they'll tell you what's behind the wall. Okay. Uh, I don't know who you think is living a reclusive life like that, but I would say it's Mr. Barrett. So I'll give another point. I'm at 4. The next verse mentions a kid with a hallucination, and they're making love with girls in magazines, and wonders if you are sleeping with your newfound faith, and could anyone love him, or is it just a crazy dream? Mr. Barrett, of course, never married, and um, his own music seems to relay this incredible loneliness of not being loved and accepted. So I'll give that 5 points. Now a few questions are asked. If they show a dark side, would you hold them? If they open their heart and show their weakness, what would you do? Sell your story, or take the children away and leave them alone? Now there are a number of child references in Mr. Barrett's music. We mentioned that in a song like Dolly Rocker and a few others that seem to be referencing a child. Of course, Mr. Roger Waters may have had the same fear as he was divorced, I believe, at this point in time. So I believe he probably had kids and was maybe worried about that. I don't know. And smile reassurance as he whispered on the phone, send him packing or take him home. I just want to point out something. That last question, or would you take me home? That is not something that most men would ask. I'm going to give a point for that, because that is a sexual inversion. That is a role reversal. Normally the person driving or taking people around is the male. So here, would you send me packing or would you take me home? That looks like an inversion, which would be a Syd Barrett kind of a note. So I'm at 7 points. So this person thought they had to bear their naked feelings and tear a curtain down. So of course, tearing the curtain down is tied up in the Wizard of Oz, the man behind the curtain. But our soul also in Marcel Duchamp in his art, this idea of hiding things behind a curtain to draw the eye to what's hidden. Now this person mentions that they had a blade and they were prepared to make it, but they never had the nerve to make the final cut because the phone rang. So that appears to be indicative of deep, deep depression. I just want to point that out. So quite disconcerting to hear about. And now we understand the meaning of the album's title, The Final Cut. And what held it back was a phone call. So someone outside that happened to call at that time. And perhaps that's important to think that we do have an impact on one another, and showing kindness to one another can help us each deal with our own pain. So that's a very simple statement, but it's, I think, quite true. All right, so we've kind of run through the songs, and I think it's appropriate now for me to kind of mention my notes and some takeaways and some things I consider to be points of interest, let's say. So the first one is, I would just like to point out to you, if you consider some of the, in my opinion, more mature topics that are discussed in this film, one of them is, of course, the possibility or the references to drug abuse. Now, what I would like you to notice is that there are no psychedelic references in here. And of course, early Pink Floyd was referred to very specifically as psychedelic. And people make claims, numerous people have made claims, you can read the material on Syd Barrett all you like, that he was heavily influenced by psychedelics. So you would think that if this had some influence of Mr. Barrett in it, that there might be psychedelic references. You could argue, I suppose, that the pool scene where Pink, the character Pink, is kind of splashing around in the water and is falling, could be a psychedelic reference. You could argue that the ride in the car is a psychedelic reference, where he's kind of pulling away his skin and he becomes this dictator. There are things like that in here, but very, very direct psychedelic references are not included. There are alcoholic references in this film, direct. There also is a somewhat direct reference to opiates, and that is in the bands on the leg that we noted in our previous episode, and also in a few songs. So that's a point of interest to me, of course, because the psychedelic aspect may be, if it is in there and you think it's in there, then I would argue that it's a secondary kind of reference. Now, the second thing that I come away with is, what is up with the punk references? This thing is full of punk references, and we just discussed the influences on Run Like Hell to the Blondie intro, which seems very similar, as well as, all the violent scenes, the children kind of rebelling in school, smashing a TV with guitar. This all seems very, very punk, and of course punk was heavily influenced by the 60s. Men like Jim Morrison, bands like the Velvet Underground, and you could argue Pink Floyd, as we discussed in our intro. Is Pink Floyd trying to destroy pop music? Certainly possible. Now, one of the things that I've kind of wondered is, why would Pink Floyd be considered punk? Now, you can say theoretically or philosophically, perhaps, but the sound of their music is what I would consider to be almost like classical jazz. So, a rock and roll classical jazz kind of feel to it. So, how punk are they really? Well, obviously not necessarily in delivery, but in the material itself. The idea of and I'll have to clarify this with a story. If you are familiar with George Orwell and you've read the book 1984, the hero is very complex. He's a weakling. And this weak man rebels in the only way that he knows how, and that is by trying to find love. So the idea of love and finding love is not punk, or not what most people would consider to be punk. What makes it punk is that it is not acceptable in that society. And because it is not acceptable in that society, that makes it punk. It is a form of individualistic expression. And so in that way, it is punk. And in that way, Pink Floyd is a punk band. They are very expressive, and they are not adhering to what is considered to be an industry standard. So, understanding that now, what I would like to kind of point out is a few things that are kind of happening now and what has been happening through time. One of the difficult things that is, I guess you could say, a theme through time is this attempt for Western society in particular over time to be trying to achieve some form of individualistic expression or maintain it. It was highly effective in the 60s at first, before it got kind of bogged down, and before a number of its leaders were killed. And of course, eventually things kind of settled down, and then in the 80s there was this kind of punk, the late 70s to the early 80s was this kind of punk revival, and you see this again, this individualistic expression. But what were the goals of that? And this is kind of one of the things that's disturbing about this film. As we mentioned, there seems to be this rebellion against authority, but to what end? What is the desired end goal? And of course, in the 60s, there were very specific goals. The goals were equality of race, equality of sex, more representation of the people, better voice of the people, very specific things. Also, a life that perhaps wasn't dictated by the expectations of money and corporations. These things were very, very influential in the 60s, and that movement failed to a large degree. Not entirely, but eventually it seems to have been buried in time. And although there were a number of successful aspects of that movement, eventually we fell into, I guess you could say, back into what we have soft created, as Jim Morrison would say. So in the 80s we see a rebellion again, but what is it directed by? It's almost like it's directed simply by the idea of rebelling. which is extremely dangerous in my opinion. The idea of destroying things with no idea of where you want to go. And one of the reasons that's so dangerous is, of course, if you've studied the Spanish Revolution, you understand that a lack of power creates a power vacuum. And that power vacuum will be filled by one of the two groups. So either you'll have an extremely, in the world right now anyway, you'll have an extremely dictatorial communist, what we call communist, but which is actually authoritarian. It's not communist at all. Because, of course, in a communist system, the government and everything belongs to the people. But in our modern so-called communist governments of China and I guess that's really it. I don't even think the Russians pretend to be communist anymore. There actually is just a simple dictatorship. It is an empirical, totalitarian dictatorship, which is terrifying to me. So that is one of the power groups, and of course another power group is the Western money. So the banks and their associated corporations, with whatever those I guess you would call, and the people that run them, the terrifying individuals that run them. Terrifying for various reasons, including the fact that they simply view the world as something to be used for their benefit, which is a highly disturbing idea because, of course, without people making sacrifices for the benefit of other people, they lose their humanity, which is extremely disturbing. So that kind of power vacuum is going to be filled by one of those two forces, and that's why punk is dangerous. Now, we have some recent news, of course, that Malcolm X, the two individuals that supposedly were convicted for killing him, were innocent. And we have individuals like Nina Simone that kind of went a little bit batty, but she's on the record with saying that, the movement failed, and the reason is because all the leaders were killed. Look at the leaders, Malcolm X. And Malcolm X has been buried for a long time for in normal understanding because of the sometimes I guess you could say violent overtones of his demeanor. But I would like to point out that he was apparently quite a enlightened individual, and he would have been an ideal leader. And the reason for that is because he cooled over time, became more influenced by men like Martin Luther King, and eventually even turned away from his own religion. So he is a religious man who recognized the limitations of religion. What a wonderful thing. What a wise person. And to have the moral fortitude to step away in spite of danger to himself, to say and do what he thought was the right thing. A wonderful potential leader murdered. Same with Martin Luther King. Same with the Kennedy brothers. So we see these things. And of course in the 80s then, we have another individual who came over from England, John Lennon, who was also discussing political matters and was also murdered. So these things are very, very touchy. And as things are now, I see people kind of stepping away. They're stepping away again from work and from society. To what end? Of course, you can, as a society, you can run and hide and attempt to just kind of slink away into the shadows and hope that things will get better, and hope that if you watch a comedian make fun of a situation that it's actually changing the world, but it won't. And you can hope that having or watching cable news and making tweets about political issues will change the world, but of course it won't. It won't without hard work and without people stepping up and making changes. Those changes need to involve direct interaction between citizens and discussion between citizens, between people, involvement with the government, register to vote. Voting is one of the few means by which people have power anymore. And I would like to point out, of course, that economics is power, in our system. In other words, the things you choose to buy is very important, but the money potentiality of people has been significantly lessened over the last 60 years, at least in the Western society. And other powerful groups have bought political control and legal control. So we need to make sure that the systems are transparent, that we have dedicated and wise people that have a good science background, but they're also moral. They need to be moral and have some form of moral background. At any rate, I'm a little bit concerned that it seems that over time, from the 60s to the 80s to now, the voice of people, the average citizens that are kind of screaming to have normality return to their lives in some way, has gone from what is a direct 1960s go out and protest kind of a movement with goals to this kind of idea of rebellion of the punk movement, which didn't really seem to have a point. And now people are simply saying and hoping that if they quit, that the system will change. And of course it won't. So I think one of my takeaways from this film is that I see kind of a theme through time, and it's a little bit disturbing to me to think that that the will of the people over time seems to be sapping overall. Just a thought. Another thing that I would like to point out is that in the film, Pink, when he's sick, is kind of terrifying himself to sleep as a young man. And this happens to a number of people in our society now, in the Western world anyway. Children often do not sleep with their mothers or with their parents. They're often placed in rooms alone, in cribs or in beds, and for obvious medical reasons we're told that this is a good idea, but it's quite disturbing. And the reason for that is because it generates anxiety in children, because it's quite common for children to, we're mammals, by the way, so name a mammal that doesn't sleep with its own children or in the close proximity to its own children. Of course, they all do. And there's a reason for that, because of protection, but also because emotionally there's a connection there. So you have to wonder, what is the emotional impact of people sleeping away from, forcing this on their children? It's part of the reason why I kind of decided that I was not going to subject my children to that. My children were able to sleep in the same room with their mother as long as they wanted. And they're remarkably more well emotionally balanced than I was as a child, in my opinion. So I think I recognized that that was a mistake, because I lived through that mistake, and I decided personally to correct that with my own family. And that's the kind of thing that we can all do. We can recognize the faults of our past and the society that we've kind of inherited, which includes things like this massive divorce rate and the breakup of families, which is extremely damaging to children. And we can correct that. And perhaps that's identified in this movie through the character Pink and his detachment from society and the decisions he seems to make. And also it seems to be hinted at in the development of the psychotic character that becomes this dictator, this power-hungry dictator, who appears to be attempting to emotionally fill the vacuum of emotional satisfaction in his life, first with his mother and then with his love interests that are it's all emptiness. And that emptiness can be filled with consumer products. Of course, people want to sell those things, but you know, this seems to be a flawed type of situation that has damaged our children and ourselves for long enough, in my opinion. So it's something that can be corrected, and this is one of the things that perhaps people are learning, because so many of us have spent time at home, that we can directly interact with our children, and that direct interaction can be very fulfilling for us, but also provide them with something that has been lacking for quite some time. Another kind of thing, I guess, that's a little bit disturbing is at the end of the film, they show kids kind of cleaning up the mess of previous generations. And that's disturbing to me because as technology increases over time, it becomes more and more difficult to clean up the mess. And as problems are ignored for longer and longer, they become more and more difficult to deal with. For example, global warming. If you saw the video that I linked, if you are knowledgeable on the topic, you recognize that this is something that has been known for like 70 years. And because it is not something that is easily correctable, in other words, turning away from burning fossil fuels is very, very difficult to do. And refusing to tear apart forests for the money that's tied within them is something that is very difficult for people to do. The problem hasn't been resolved. But it is not a problem that we can just turn over to our children. It needs to be corrected now. And by now, I mean within the next 5 years. It needs to be prioritized and resolved by politicians, and it needs to be recognized by people of power. We have problems, and we kind of need to clean them up, and we need the right people in place to do so. So how can that happen? Well, in our breakdown of Dark Side of the Moon, Did Syd Dark Side of Oz, one of the things we discussed is this kind of positive and negative aspect of women as they age. And this is a very stereotypical statement, but it's kind of handled in that film with the witches. We intimated that because Dorothy has the slippers and is able to perform magic, that she is a form of a witch, and she is a good witch. The Wicked Witch of the West, I think it was, is the one that survives, is covered in green, and she is old because she has become a person that has been twisted by society through envy and the desire to maintain her own beauty and fertility, which is embodied in the ruby slippers. That is specifically kind of shown, well, it's symbolically shown at any rate. So, of course, throughout that film, there is a battle happening within Dorothy. Is she going to be a good witch or a bad witch? That's the battle that's happening, and we see what happens if you choose to be a bad witch. Now, for the wall, what we appear to be seeing is a very similar idea. Pink is growing. What kind of a person is he going to be? He is the hero, I guess you could say, of the film. Is he going to become this kind of twisted witch of a man, a warlock, I guess you could say, or this evil politician who is adhering to something that I think a lot of men want to hold on to, their specific form of power as they age. Now, of course, as men age, they lose their physical power, but they can still wield social power. That social power is what is held by a twisted politician. And that is the male form of the witch in The Wizard of Oz. And that is being relayed in this film, The Wall. So, I don't think people realize the extreme danger of having corrupt politicians is to the entirety of not just their own nation, but the entire planet. And for this reason, democracy is ideal because it involves changing leaders over time. And because power corrupts over time, having people in positions of power for long periods of time is extremely dangerous. Not only because it saps the will of the people, they see that working and having intelligence and being creative and performing works that are great and doing great things don't matter. But they also have their voice quieted over time. And that seems to be relayed in the discussion of the punk versus the 60s counterculture movement. So, there's a danger to this, of course, in that over time, the influence of money and power can move into various industries. And of course, one of them is the news industry, which is tied to the television. There are so many television references within this film that I won't even bother to go through and mention them all. They're all talking about very strange topics. It seems disjointed. We went through some of them a little bit. But I'll give you an example right now. In the United States right now, the Rittenhouse jury just acquitted a young man for, I guess, he was being charged with murder or something like that. of 2 deaths and 1 person being shot. But at any rate, a young man with a rifle went there supposedly to help protect people and help them, and he got in an argument with some other folks and shot him. This news has been throughout the United States for like the last 2 weeks. This is exactly what the media does. They discuss and force a discussion on topics that they want to discuss because it appeals to the left and to the right. I will point to you that almost 1,000 people are dying a day from COVID right now in the United States. 1,000 people a day. What are their names? Who are they? What do they believe? What are their families like? 1,000 people a day are dying, and it's not being discussed at all. And this is how the media discusses things and forces a discussion on people that are clearly divisionary in nature. Did you know that more than 100,000 people in the United States have died due to substance abuse this year? They have overdosed. More than 100,000 people this year have died from drug overdoses. Who were they? What were their names? What were they like? What were their dreams? What were their possible contributions to society? None of this is known. They're simply removed. And we're forced to listen to morons talk about Rittenhouse constantly, all day, every day. I won't say it's not a discussion that's worth happening, but I will say that the frustration that the average citizen has right now, that the problems that they are facing, it's not being accurately discussed, it's not being accurately resolved. This is a very specific problem, and without accurate political movement, the problem will not cease. In fact, it will only get worse over time. So, let's finish up with a few ideas, and then we'll kind of jump into perhaps some form of explanation as to why, if there was some kind of animosity between Mr. Barrett and Mr. Waters at this time, what might be happening here, and what are some possible reasons? Or between the band and between Mr. Waters, I don't know. So the first thing that I intimated is, of course, the idea of 515, and I'll kind of give you a little graph here that shows what I would say geometrically what happens at 515, which basically involves the idea of human beauty, humanity, from the past to the present of one, and then in the future again, human beauty and spirit. So let's look at numbers. I'm looking at a dictionary of symbols. So obviously 515, those are numbers. So let's look at the number 5 and what it might stand for. And it's very simple. So if you are familiar with these ideas, then you probably know these already. At any rate, 5 is symbolic of man. It is healthy and love. It is quintessence acting upon matter, or spirit acting upon matter. It is 4 limbs and the head. It is likewise the fingers and the thumb. So it is the material world that is moved by brain or spirit. Quite an interesting idea for someone that is not spiritually aware or awakened. So this seems to be quite a deep idea. We have 5, the potentialities of man going into 1, going back into 5. And I just want to point out, of course, the numerous prism descriptions that are discussed in Dark Side of the Moon. There's the prism on the cover, and also looking through the prism of Piper at the Gates of Dawn. So what does the number 1 mean? 1 is symbolic of being or existing, revelation of spiritual essence, active principle. For many people, the number 1 represents the God of the material world. It is the mystic center, the irradiating point, supreme power, spiritual unity. So 1 is also equated with light. So there is another prism idea. 1 is equated with light. So we have this light of inspiration that is influenced by the beauty and potentiality of man. Now, of course, 5 is also tied to pentagrams for various reasons. I won't get into all of, I don't know what you would call that necessarily. It's occult history, I guess, but these numbers and ideas are very, very old ideas. They can be used for good or bad. So the number 5 obviously ties in with humanity and spirit movement to one point in time, which would be the present. In other words, being tied to the present and then spreading back out again into humanity, which is what an enlightened message would do, correct? Quite an interesting idea, and that may be what is being done here in this film. So for this reason, the room number 515 may be indicating the intent of the artist. And I will point out, of course, as we did kind of mention, the idea that is captured within the song, your possible pasts. This specifically mentions, they flutter behind you, your possible past. So there is your possible past reference, numerous past, which is tied to the idea of the first 5. And then the lyric also states, in command of your possible futures. So there's your possible futures comment. Again, the future 5. And if you're in command of your presence, that's the 1. So in that song right there is the reference verbally to the idea of 515, and that is, of course, the room that appears to be possibly existed by the character Pink in the very beginning of the film. So, why is that important? Well, of course, that particular song isn't even used in the soundtrack for the film. Isn't that interesting? That song seems to specifically be pointing to a scene in the film, but it is not included in the film. Now, that could be done for various reasons, including one of which might be that it simply wasn't necessary, that people could look at the room 515 and infer what is happening. I would argue that no, it's not an easy thing for people to do, and that without your knowledge of this song, your possible past, you will not recognize the importance of that number and what is being relayed within the film. So, who would be likely to do something like that? Well, we mentioned it did Syd Moore Meadows. The ideas that are tied, the sub-layer ideas that are tied within the album More, and of course the film that's associated with it. Now, also of interest, in my opinion, is The Gunner's Dream, and we specifically mentioned the song The Final Cut as being highly related or influenced perhaps by Mr. Barrett. So who is this Gunner character? Was this Gunner character supposed to be included in the film? Because there is no Gunner character in the film. I don't have an answer for that, but perhaps that would explain a bit of a falling out. So let's go ahead then. We've run through this material. We've run through a number of ideas. Let's see if we can kind of answer some questions. What might be some of the reasons for Pink Floyd to kind of break up and perhaps Mr. Barrett and Mr. Waters to have a falling out, which appears to have happened around this time, as we discussed in the previous episode? Well, the first might be that there's simply a breakup with the band, that the band may, as many people have relayed, have been tired of not being overly involved in the creative process of this soundtrack in the film. So, of course, Mr. Waters is identified as putting together the screenplay, the lyrics, and the sense of overall of the film. There are some obvious statements within the film that correlate to Mr. Waters' life. That may have been kind of a friction point for the band. Remember now, the band is quite successful at this point in time. The idea of going through and doing kind of a self-involved vanity project of sorts, I would argue, of course, personally, I would argue that this is not simply a Waters vanity piece. The reason for that is because we have noted the influence of 3 different people in the character Pink: Mr. Waters, Mr. Barrett, and possibly Jim Morrison. So, this seems to be more of an artistic expression than it is simply a biography of some sort. So, is it possible that perhaps, to my knowledge, the person that initiated the breakup of the band, that was, the band may have not been happy with this, but my understanding is that Mr. Waters is the one that started the breakup of the band. Now, that may have been due to various reasons, including people just not wanting to work together anymore, not having anything else to say, or perhaps it's a vanity thing. Who knows? But if Mr. Barrett was involved at all anymore with this band, and you can decide that on your own, he may still have felt that this was an outlet of sorts for a message or something along those lines. And you have to ask, of course, is that something that would have affected him and made him quite angry? And if so, who would he have blamed? And then perhaps you can kind of draw your own conclusion. Now, another possible thing that might be disturbing to someone that is detail-oriented, and I would argue that, much like Stanley Kubrick, Mr. Barrett could be quite detail-oriented. And that is that the inclusion of very important songs, which, and we noted, if you haven't noticed, that the lyrics are quite different on the Final Cut album. Why was the Final Cut album made? I don't know. What's being intended there? I don't know. What is the intent of the film in its totality with the music? If someone, for example, was simply putting together music and then someone else was directing a screenplay, they may not match. And that may have had differences that would have been quite irritating to someone that was detail-oriented. And specifically mentioned the number 515 and the song Your Possible Pass. That seems to be directly tied to a scene in the film. So, what all is meant to be included in the film The Wall? What was the dream vision of the numerous players, and did it align? Possibly not. And of course, we mentioned in the past the breakup with the French group that was making that put together More and also La Vallée, which became Obscured by Clouds, and how someone in the group or someone in that within the group's power structure did not approve of that film, The Valley, and so they broke off ties with that filming group. And perhaps that's happening here as well. Perhaps there are things within this film which were disturbing, and we noted what a few of them might be. Perhaps the portrayal and use of personal stories by Mr. Barrett was not appreciated. I don't know. You decide. Perhaps the shaving incident is not accurately portraying what actually was intended by that. And we mentioned before, of course, that could be a religious practice, a spiritual practice, which is likened to a form of psychopathic, almost insanity in the film. That may also have not been approved of. Again, the idea of the phone, this recurring idea of the phone, and the story of calling from the United States. That may have been an extremely personal moment. We've discussed that in Apples and Oranges, Peeling Syd Barrett Apples and Oranges. That may be revealing a bit too much for someone's liking. So that may have caused a little bit of a I guess you could say a little bit of a break or a little bit of unhappiness in the people that are involved. So we've run through a number of things here, and I guess that pretty much sums up my breakdown of The Wall, the influences within it, the time, the context, as much context as I can give. Hopefully this is something that has given some topics to kind of think about. Hopefully it pushes people to kind of consider what might be intended by the individuals that put together this work of art. And I will say that it is a work of art. It's a little bit messy, and I do think perhaps that it is a bit negative and depressing. But it's asking us, in my opinion, a very serious question about how our topics going to be handled, like how our political problems going to be resolved, how our personal problems going to be resolved, how our social problems going to be resolved. And these all tie together, of course, because if you have a sickness in one area, it will affect all the other areas of our lives. In a way, perhaps that's a positive thing. Perhaps that's what's intended by the end of the film with the children cleaning up, that the children will be able to overcome these things. Of course, the problem with that, in my opinion, is that, generally speaking, children are not powerful. They are not powerful enough to enact change, and of course they lack wisdom because they don't have life experience. So the people that need to clean up are adults, in my opinion. So that's pretty much it. I do hope that this has given you some ideas to think about. Hopefully it's been enjoyable. As I mentioned before, I want to run through Did Syd, T-Rex, and Mark Bolan next. I'm going to have a kind of a prelude, which I think will throw some ideas at you in a form of music form that will be kind of funny, I think. At any rate, that's pretty much it for now. I hope you enjoyed this, and I will talk to you later.